The thing about the Ironveil Pack's great hall was that it had been built to hold the weight of important moments. 6 generations of alphas had stood at the front of that room and changed things, declared wars, ended them, named heirs, buried them. The stone walls had absorbed all of it. The torchlight had witnessed all of it. There was a particular quality to the air in that hall, a density, the feeling of standing inside something that understood it was being used for history. Zara Cole had cleaned that hall every week for 3 years before she was old enough to attend the gatherings inside it. She knew where the drafts came from. She knew which torches burned faster than the others. She knew that the stone on the east wall held moisture in winter, and that if you stood near it for too long, you could feel the cold moving through the rock like something alive. She knew that hall the way she knew everything about Ironveil, from the inside. From the parts nobody important ever saw, from the hours before and after the moments that mattered when the room was empty and honest and just a room. She was standing at the back of it now, in the gray wool coat she had worn because it was December, and not because she had known what tonight was going to be, watching 400 wolves arrange themselves in the formal configuration that meant something significant was about to happen. And she was doing what she always did in rooms full of people who did not see her. She was paying attention. The alpha took the podium at exactly 8 o'clock. He was precise about time the way he was precise about everything, not because punctuality was important to him personally, but because every choice he made in public was a signal, and arriving exactly when expected signaled that everything was under control. Zara had spent 6 years learning to read Darian Steele's signals. She read this one. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the east wall. He did not look for her in the crowd. She noticed that first, the way his eyes moved across the room during the 3 seconds before he spoke, doing the automatic sweep that alphas did, cataloging who was present and where, and did not stop on her, did not hesitate, did not give any sign that the thing he was about to say had anything to do with anyone specific in that room. That was the first signal. She had time to think one complete thought. She had time to think, I know what this is, before he leaned into the microphone with the calm of a man who has already made peace with a decision and is only now making it official, and said her name into 400 wolves' worth of silence. Zara Cole is no longer a member of this pack. He did not look at her when he said it. Later, weeks later, in a small house in a town that did not know her name, lying in a bed that was entirely hers, she would think about that more than anything else. Not the words, not the 400 faces turning toward her in a single slow wave, wearing the particular expression of people watching something terrible happen to someone else and feeling underneath the shock the shameful animal relief of not them, not me, not tonight. Not the sound the hall made in the 2 seconds of absolute silence after he finished speaking, which was the sound of 6 generations of stone absorbing one more moment of history. Just the fact that he had not looked at her. She had spent 6 years in the same building as Darian Steele, had sat in more meetings than she could count, had passed him in corridors, had submitted reports that he read and implemented without acknowledgment. I had been in rooms where his eyes moved across every face and stopped on hers for exactly the same duration as every other face, the duration of a man cataloging something present, not something seen. She had told herself for 6 years that she did not need him to see her. Standing at the back of the great hall in her gray wool coat with her name still in the air and 400 faces turned toward her, she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she had been lying. She picked up her bag. The strap went over her shoulder the way it always did, her hand finding it automatically, her body doing the practical thing while the rest of her processed something too large to hold all at once. She was good at that. She had learned it young, the particular skill of keeping your hands moving when your mind needed time. She looked at the back of his head. He was already turning away, already moving on. Already reaching for whatever came next on the agenda of a man who had just exiled someone in 23 words and considered the matter resolved. Something crystallized in her chest that had been liquid for a very long time. Not anger. Anger was what people used to dismiss you. The evidence they needed that you were unstable, that your response to being wronged was itself the problem. She had watched it happen to other wolves in this pack. I'd had watched legitimate grievances get buried under the optics of how they were expressed, and she had spent years making sure that weapon would never be available to anyone who wanted to use it against her. Not grief, either. She had been grieving this for longer than tonight, in pieces, in the quiet of rooms nobody else entered, and there was nothing left of that particular grief to spend in public. What crystallized was something that had no softness in it at all. It was the specific, cold, a load-bearing clarity of a woman who has just been shown, beyond any remaining possibility of doubt, exactly where she stands, and has decided that where she stands is not where she is going to stay. She walked toward the door. The crowd parted. Not the way crowds part for alphas, not deferentially, not with the automatic deference of people making room for something powerful. They parted the way people part for something they cannot read, or something that does not match the script they came prepared for. They had expected tears. She could feel it. The collective readiness for devastation, the way the room had braced for the particular spectacle of a woman publicly destroyed. They got a woman in a gray wool coat walking toward the exit like she had somewhere to be. She did. The archives were in the oldest part of the Ironveil compound. Not because anyone had planned it that way. Not because some long-ago alpha had looked at the blueprints and decided that the records of everything the pack had ever done should live in the building that had stood the longest. It had happened the way most things in Ironveil happened. Gradually, then permanently. One generation leaving something in a room because it was convenient, the next generation finding it there and assuming it had always been meant to be there. And by the third generation, it was tradition, and tradition in a wolf pack is indistinguishable from law. Zara had understood this about Ironveil before she understood most other things about it. She had been 11 years old the first time she walked into the archives, not because anyone sent her, because she had followed a question, a small, specific, completely inconvenient question about a territorial boundary dispute that her father had mentioned at dinner and that the adults around her had immediately stopped discussing when they noticed she was listening. And the question had led her here, to this room, to walls of records that nobody had organized properly in at least 2 decades, and she had spent 4 hours in there on a Saturday afternoon finding the answer. She had been 11. She had found it in 40 minutes. The remaining 3 hours and 20 minutes she had spent reading everything else. The head archivist at the time, an old wolf named Brennan who had seen everything and trusted nothing, had found her there at dusk, cross-legged on the floor surrounded by 6 generations of territorial documents, and had looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. He had not told her to leave. He had pulled up a chair. For the next 7 years, until Brennan retired and moved to the coast to do nothing in particular, Zara had spent every Saturday in that room, learning. Not because anyone asked her to, not because it was building toward anything specific, because the records of what a pack had done were also the records of what it was capable of, the patterns, the mistakes, the moments when it had been better than expected, and the moments when it had been exactly as bad as it was capable of being. And Zara had understood instinctively, at 11 years old, that knowing those things was not the same as having power. But it was the foundation of it. She was 22 when Brennan left and the archives fell apart. Not dramatically, not the way things fall apart in stories, with a single catastrophic moment that everyone can point to afterward. The way things actually fall apart, which is slowly and then suddenly, with nobody noticing until the damage is significant enough that ignoring it is no longer an option. It took 2 years and 3 archivists who were competent at other things before someone looked at the state of the records and understood that what they needed was not an archivist. What they needed was Zara Cole. Nobody asked her. Oh, that was the thing she would tell you if you asked her about it. If you were the kind of person she would tell things to, which was a shorter list than most people assumed. Nobody came to her office and offered her the position and told her the pack needed her specifically. The position was posted. She applied. She was ranked third in the interview process behind two candidates who had more formal credentials and less actual knowledge. And she was given the job because both of the other candidates declined it when they saw the state of what they were being asked to fix. She had walked into the archive room on her first official day and stood in the doorway for 30 seconds looking at 6 years of accumulated disorder, misfiled records, incomplete territorial documents, alliance agreements that had expired without anyone noting their expiration, historical precedents that were being ignored in current council decisions because nobody knew they existed anymore, and felt something that she would later identify in retrospect as the precise opposite of dread. She had felt at home. It had taken her 18 months to rebuild it properly, not to make it functional. Functional she had managed in 6 weeks, to make it what Brennan had always said it should be and never quite had the resources to achieve: a living record. A breathing document of everything the pack was and had been and was capable of being, organized not just by date and category but by relevance, so that any wolf who walked in with a question could find not just the answer, but the context around the answer, the history that explained why the answer was what it was. She had done this alone, at her own pace, without announcement or update or request for recognition. Darian Steele had been alpha for 8 months when she finished. He had sent a one-line message through his beta that said the archival restructuring had been noted and was appreciated. Zara had read it, set her phone face down on her desk, and gone back to work. It was the most communication they had ever had. She thought about Brennan a lot in the 40 minutes after she walked out of the Great Hall, not because the memory was comforting, though it was in the specific way that memories of people who saw you clearly are always comforting, like the way they function as evidence against the narrative that nobody ever did. She thought about him because he had told her something, in her last conversation with him before he left for the coast, that she had filed away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not immediately useful but would be eventually. So he had said, and she had been 22 and had not entirely understood it yet, that the most dangerous thing a person could be in a powerful organization was indispensable and invisible simultaneously. Indispensable meant they could not remove you without consequence. Invisible meant they would try anyway, because people in power are uncomfortable with debts they have not chosen to acknowledge, and the most efficient way to resolve an unacknowledged debt is to eliminate the person it is owed to. She had thought about that conversation on and off for 3 years. She understood it completely now. The archive door recognized her handprint for the last time. She did not let herself feel that. She filed it, put it in the same place she had put the one-line message, the 6 years of passing in corridors, the 23 words into a microphone, and kept moving. She worked quickly and without drama. She knew exactly what she was entitled to take and exactly what she was not, and she took only the former and left everything else in precisely the order she had put it in, because she was not a person who left things in disorder even when disorder would have been justified. 22 minutes. She had given 6 years to this room. She said goodbye to it in 22 minutes and walked back out into the December cold and did not look back. The bond, the pack bond, the invisible thread that had connected her to Ironveil for 24 years, that she had felt as background hum for so long she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own heartbeat, had gone strange and thin while she was inside the archive. By the time she reached her car, it had gone quiet. Not severed. She knew what severance felt like, had been present for 2 formal severances in her time with the pack, or had felt the sharp collective flinch that moved through every wolf present when a bond was cut clean. This was not that. This was the sound of something that had been abandoned so many times it had finally, quietly, accepted it. She sat in her car for exactly 60 seconds. Not crying. Not because she was holding it back. She had done her crying already, 2 nights ago, alone on the kitchen floor with the lights off and the windows closed. 1 hour that she had given herself and meant to honor. She had honored it. She had given that grief exactly what it was owed and not a second more. She sat in her car for 60 seconds because she was a thorough person and she wanted to make sure she had thought of everything. Then she started the engine and drove. There was one person in the Ironveil Pack who had known what Zara was worth. His name was Eli Vance, and he was 26 years old. And he was currently sitting in the back row of the Great Hall watching the aftermath of the most wrong thing he had witnessed in 4 years of pack membership. And he was doing something that Eli Vance almost never did. He was afraid. Not of Darian, not of the pack, not of the political machinery that had just been used on someone who did not deserve it and could not have stopped it. He was afraid because he had watched Zara Cole pick up her bag and walk out of that hall, and he had seen her face for just 1 second, one unguarded second before she put it away. And what he had seen in it was not devastation. It was clarity. And Eli Vance, who had known Zara for 4 years and understood her better than most people understood anything, knew that Zara Cole, in a state of absolute clarity, was the most quietly, irreversibly dangerous thing he had ever encountered. He pulled out his phone under the cover of the commotion that had started up around him. 400 wolves processing what they had just witnessed, the noise of a room trying to rearrange its understanding of something, and sent her a message. 3 words. I'm so sorry. He watched the message deliver. Watched it sit there, unread, as Zara's location moved away from the compound and kept moving. He put his phone away. Looked at the front of the room where Darian was already in conversation with his beta, already on to the next thing, already performing the particular composure of a man who has done something difficult and is determined to treat it as concluded. Eli had known Darian Steele for 4 years, too. He knew the difference between a man who was composed and a man who was performing composure. Why, he also knew, because he had been in a room 3 weeks ago where something had been said that he had not been meant to hear, that he had spent 3 weeks trying to decide what to do with, exactly why Darian had done what he had done tonight. It was not what the room thought. It was not what Zara thought. It was something considerably worse than either. 3 weeks after the exile, Zara Cole was sitting in a rented kitchen in a town called Ashford when she finally read Eli's message. Not because she had forgotten it was there. She knew it was there. Had known it was there the same way you know about a bruise you are not ready to press yet, the way you route around something that requires more of you than you currently have available. She had been building toward having enough to give it since the night she drove away from Ironveil, and 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning with coffee going warm beside her and a consulting contract for the Voss Pack open on her laptop and the bird in the tree at the end of the garden doing its complicated thing, she decided she was ready. She opened her phone. There were 14 messages from Eli. The first one, sent the night of the exile, 3 words, I'm so sorry. She read and sat down and breathed through and picked back up. The next 11 were variations of the same thing. Checking in. Telling her he was thinking about her. Sending her information about the consulting contracts that had already reached out. She noticed he had done this carefully, practically, giving her useful things instead of just feelings, which was exactly what she would have done in his position and exactly why she had trusted him for 4 years. The 13th message was different. It had been sent 6 days ago, at 2 in the morning, which told her everything about the state he had been in when he sent it. Eli Vance did not send messages at 2 in the morning. He was methodical about communication the way Zara was methodical about records, deliberate, considered, nothing sent before it was ready. 2 in the morning meant something had broken through the deliberateness. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she set her phone face down on the table and looked at the bird in the tree for a long time without seeing it. The 14th message had been sent 20 minutes after the 13th. 4 words. Forget I said that. She turned her phone back over, read the 13th message one more time, put the phone in her pocket and went back to the Voss Pack contract and spent the next 4 hours doing the best work she had done in years, which was what she always did when she needed her mind to process something it was not ready to hold directly, gave it something else to do, something demanding enough to occupy the front of it while the back of it worked quietly on the thing that mattered. By the time she closed the laptop, she had made a decision. She was going to need to go back to Ironveil. Not for Darian. She needed to be precise about that, needed to say it clearly to herself in the kitchen of this house that was hers, in a town that did not know her name. Not for the pack bond that had gone quiet in the December cold. Not for the 24 years of belonging to something that had turned out to be considerably more conditional than she had understood. For the truth. Because what Eli had written at 2 a.m, what he had immediately tried to unsend, what he had spent 6 days sitting on and had broken under the weight of, was not about her exile. It was about why. And the why, if Eli was right, if what he had heard in that room 3 weeks before the Great Hall was what he thought it was, changed everything. The thing about Darian Steele was that he had never wanted to be alpha. This was not something anyone in Ironveil knew. It was not something anyone outside his family knew. It was, in fact, something that only 2 people alive had ever been told directly. His mother, who had responded by sitting in silence for a long time and then saying that wanting was a luxury that some people were not born into, and his best friend from childhood, a wolf named Cass, who had died in a territorial dispute 4 years ago and taken the knowledge with him. Darian had wanted to be a builder, not metaphorically, not in the leadership sense of building something lasting, building a legacy, the language that alphas used when they talked about their ambitions. He had wanted to build things with his hands, structures. He had spent 3 years before his father's death, drawing plans for buildings that would never be constructed, teaching himself architectural principles from books he ordered and kept in a locked drawer, spending weekends on the territory's outskirts learning what the land could hold. His father had known and had not said anything, which was its own kind of thing to carry. When his father died, unexpectedly, a cardiac event, a wolf who had shown no signs of weakness suddenly and completely gone on an ordinary Thursday morning, Darian had been 23 years old and the heir to the most significant pack in the region, and there was exactly one path available to him. He had locked the drawings in the drawer. He had never unlocked it again. This was not, he had told himself in the years that followed, a tragedy. It was a reality. The world was full of people who did not get to live the life they would have chosen and managed to build something real from the life they were given. And there was nothing noble about mourning the unlived version when the lived one had genuine weight and genuine consequence and people who depended on it. He had told himself this so many times it had become something he no longer needed to tell himself. It had become just true. A settled thing. A room he had closed and stopped thinking about. He had been alpha for 8 months when he first noticed Zara Cole. Not in the way. He needed to be precise about this, in the accounting he did with himself in the quiet. Not in the way that would have been simpler. Not with the clean recognition of an attraction that could be named and managed. He had noticed her the way you notice something that does not fit the pattern you have been using to understand a place. An anomaly, a thing that requires a new category. He had been reviewing the archival restructuring report, not because he had asked for it. His beta had put it on his desk with a note that said the work was complete and he should be aware of the new organizational system. He had read it expecting to spend 20 minutes on it. He had spent 4 hours, not because it was complicated, because it was extraordinary. In 18 months working alone, Zara Cole had not just reorganized the Ironveil archives. She had rebuilt the pack's institutional memory from the ground up, had created a system so precisely designed for the specific needs of this specific pack that it could only have been made by someone who understood Ironveil at a depth that most of its senior members did not. She had cross-referenced historical decisions with their outcomes in a way that made the pack's patterns visible, its recurring mistakes, its underused strengths, its blind spots. She had, essentially, written a diagnosis of everything Ironveil was and everything it was failing to be, and filed it in a room that nobody important ever visited. He had sent the one-line message because it was what protocol suggested and because he did not yet have language for what he actually wanted to say, which was, "Who are you, and how long have you been here, and why has nobody told me about you?" He had found the answer to the last question himself. She had been there for 6 years. She had been there before him. She had been doing work of this quality in invisible places for 6 years, and nobody had told him because the people around him had long since arranged themselves into a configuration that served their own interests. And a woman in the archives who was better at understanding the pack than most of the council was not in anyone's interest to elevate. Except the pack's. He had started reading her previous work after that. Going back through 6 years of reports and recommendations and quiet interventions, finding her fingerprints on things he had assumed were the work of senior wolves, understanding slowly and then all at once the shape of what she had been doing. He had not gone to her directly. He had told himself this was because it was not appropriate. Because an alpha singling out an omega-ranked wolf for personal attention without clear professional context was the kind of thing that created problems. But that could be read as pressure rather than recognition. That required care. He had told himself this for 2 years. He had been lying for most of them. The council meeting had happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the Great Hall, 3 weeks before the microphone and the 23 words and the gray wool coat walking toward the door. Darian had not called the meeting. But he had walked into a room expecting a routine territorial review and found 8 of his 12 council members already seated, already arranged in the particular configuration of people who have agreed something before the person they need to agree it in front of has arrived. He had sat down. He had listened. What they presented was organized and thorough and had clearly been in preparation for longer than one Wednesday. It had the texture of something that had been built carefully, with attention to his specific objections, designed to be as difficult as possible to argue against. The core of it was simple. There was a wolf in the Ironveil archives who knew more about the pack's vulnerabilities than any outside force had ever known. Who had access to every alliance document, every territorial agreement, every financial record, every quietly buried mistake. Who had, in the course of rebuilding the archival system, essentially created a complete map of everything that could be used against Ironveil if it ever ended up in the wrong hands. They were not accusing her of anything. They were precise about that. They used the word risk 11 times in 40 minutes and the word guilt not once. They were saying that the risk existed. They were saying that the risk was unacceptable. They were saying that the solution was removal, clean, immediate, before anything could be compromised. Darian had sat very still through all of it. He had asked 3 questions. The answers to all 3 had been prepared in advance. Then he had asked the question they had not prepared for. Who brought this to you? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. In a room full of wolves who were expert at controlling their reactions, 3 seconds of silence was a very long time. The concern arose organically, the council's senior member said finally. From multiple sources. I asked who brought it to you. Another silence. That information is protected under council deliberation privilege. Darian had looked at the 8 faces around the table, had read them the way he read everything, carefully, without letting what he found show on his face. He had found what he was looking for on the 5th face. He had adjourned the meeting, had spent 3 days doing something he had not done since the first year of his leadership. When he was 23 and new and had not yet learned to trust the systems around him, he had investigated independently, quietly, without telling anyone what he was doing or why. What he found on the 3rd day had not surprised him. It had, however, made everything considerably worse, because the wolf who had brought the concern to the council, who had built the case against Zara carefully and thoroughly over a period of months, who had identified her as a risk and packaged that identification in language that was impossible to argue against without looking like you were choosing one wolf's interests over the pack's security, was the same wolf who had been systematically, quietly, for the last 2 years, doing exactly what they had accused Zara of. Using privileged access to pack information for purposes that did not serve Ironveil. Darian had the evidence, Solid, documented, irrefutable. He also had a problem. The wolf who had done this was not acting alone. They were protected, connected to 3 of the 8 council members who had sat across from him that Wednesday, connected in ways that went back further than his tenure and were woven into the political fabric of the pack at a depth that pulling on them would unravel things he was not yet ready to unravel. He had 2 choices. The first was to expose everything immediately. Take the evidence to the full council, force a confrontation. I burn the political structure that had been used against Zara to the ground. The consequences of this, and he had modeled them, had spent 2 days running through every iteration, were significant. A fractured council in a pack that was currently navigating 2 active territorial disputes. The kind of internal instability that rival packs watched for and moved against. Wolves who were loyal to the compromised council members who would interpret the confrontation as a power grab rather than a correction. It was the right thing. It was also, at that specific moment, a thing that could genuinely damage the pack beyond his ability to repair it. The second choice was to remove Zara himself, to make the exile look like a concession to the council's concerns, to give them what they asked for in a way that positioned him as responsive rather than threatened, while he spent the time her absence bought him dismantling the actual problem at its roots. The exile as a strategy. Not a conclusion. A temporary, devastating, necessary strategy. He had sat with that for a long time. He had told himself that she would understand eventually, that he would explain, that the thing he was doing to her was not the thing it looked like, and that there would be a moment, after the council was handled, after the political structure was dismantled, after the real threat was removed, when he would be able to tell her everything. He had told himself this, and had walked to the podium and said her name into the microphone and watched, from the corner of his eye he had not been able to fully control, the gray wool coat pick up its bag and walk toward the door. He had told himself that she would understand. He had spent 3 weeks trying to believe it. Eli's message had said this. There's something you need to know about why he did it. I was outside the council room 3 weeks ago, and I heard things I wasn't supposed to hear. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know if it changes anything. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe what he did is still what he did regardless of the reason. But you deserve to know the truth, and I can't keep sitting on it. I'll call me when you're ready. Zara read it a 4th time in the kitchen of the house in Ashford. She thought about 23 words into a microphone. She thought about a man who was precise about time, and precise about signals, and precise about everything, who had not looked at her when he said it. She had thought in the weeks since that the not looking was indifference, the particular cruelty of someone who does not consider you significant enough to face directly. She thought about it again now, with Eli's message sitting in her hand, and understood, with the specific intelligence that had made her indispensable and invisible for 6 years, that there was another reason a precise man might not look at someone when he was doing something to them. Not because they did not matter, because they mattered too much. She picked up her phone, called Eli. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. It took 40 minutes. When he was finished, the kitchen was completely quiet, and the bird had gone from the tree, and the afternoon light through the window had shifted from gold to the long amber of something about to become something else. Zara set her phone on the table, looked at her hands, thought about 6 years of invisible work in a room nobody important visited, thought about a one-line message that said the archival restructuring had been noted and was appreciated, thought about a man who had not looked at her when he said her name into a microphone. She stood up, filled the kettle, put it on the stove. Then she sat back down and looked at the tree where the bird had been and made a decision that she understood, even as she was making it, was going to cost her more than anything she had paid for in recent memory. Not because of what it required her to forgive, because of what it required her to risk. She called the Voss pack first, not Darian. Not Eli. Not the council or the beta or any of the machinery of Ironveil that had been moving against her for longer than she had known. The Voss pack. Specifically, she called a wolf named Maren Voss, the Alpha's younger sister, the pack's chief legal counsel, a woman Zara had worked with twice on territorial boundary disputes and had filed away in the category of people who were both brilliant and genuinely fair, which was a shorter list than it should have been in her experience of pack politics. Annie Maren answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you would call," she said, which told Zara that the story of the Ironveil exile had traveled further and faster than she had accounted for, which was useful information. "I need to ask you something," Zara said, "and I need you to answer it as a lawyer and not as someone who has a political interest in the answer." A pause. "Those two things are occasionally the same." "I know. I'm asking you to make sure they are this time." Another pause. Shorter. The pause of a woman deciding something. "Ask," Zara asked. The question took 4 minutes to fully articulate because it was not a simple question. It was the kind of question that required context, the council meeting, the accusations, the evidence Darian had found, the exile as a strategy rather than a conclusion. And Zara gave Maren all of it, precisely and without editorializing. Just the way she had always presented information. Facts first, interpretation after. Let the other person's intelligence do the work. When she finished, Maren was quiet for a long time. "You understand what you're describing," Maren said finally. "Yes. You're describing a sitting alpha who used an exile as a political maneuver to buy time against a compromised council. Oh, which means the exile was not, legally speaking, a genuine removal from pack membership." "That is what I'm describing. Which means," Maren said slowly, "that your pack bond was never formally severed. It was abandoned under duress, which is a different thing under regional pack law, a very different thing." Zara looked at the tree outside the window. "I know," she said. "Zara." Maren's voice had shifted. Not warmer exactly, but more direct. Sykes, the voice of someone setting aside professional distance because the situation required it. "What are you planning to do with this?" "I'm planning to go back to Ironveil." "As what?" "As myself," Zara said, "which is the only thing I have ever been." She left Ashford on a Thursday morning, not because Thursday had any particular significance, because she had spent Wednesday doing 3 things that needed to be done before she moved, and Thursday was when they were finished. The first thing was the documentation. She had spent 6 years building the most comprehensive record of Ironveil's institutional history that had ever existed. She had taken copies of what she was legally entitled to take on the night of the exile, not as a weapon. She had been precise about that with herself, not as leverage, as a record, as the thing she had built and was entitled to keep. Now she organized it differently. Not by category or date or the elegant cross-referenced system she had spent 18 months constructing. She organized it by relevance to a specific problem, the problem of a wolf inside Ironveil who had been using privileged pack information for purposes that did not serve the pack, who had built a case against Zara using the language of security concerns to disguise what was actually the elimination of a witness. Because that was what she was, she understood now. Not a risk. A witness. She had spent 6 years in the archive room. She had seen the records that nobody else had seen, had understood the patterns that nobody else had understood, had followed the paperwork trails that the wolf who built the case against her had been very careful to obscure, but had not been quite careful enough. Because they had not known that Zara existed, not really, not as a person who was paying attention. They had known her the way everyone in Ironveil had known her, as furniture. Furniture does not notice things. Zara had noticed everything. She spent Wednesday organizing what she had noticed into a document that was precise and irrefutable and devastating in the specific way that only the truth, properly documented, can be devastating. She did it without anger. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, thoroughly, with the particular focus of someone who understands that the quality of the work is the argument. When she was done, she sent a copy to Maren Voss with a cover note that said, "For safekeeping only, not for use without my instruction." Then she made the second call. Eli answered before the first ring had finished. "You talked to Marin," he said. Not a question. "Yes. Are you coming back?" "Yes." A silence. She could hear him breathing, could hear underneath the breathing, something that sounded like relief and something that sounded like fear in approximately equal measure. "Eli," she kept her voice even, "the wolf who built the case against me. You know who it is." Not a question either. "Yes," he said quietly. "Tell me." He did. She had known in the abstract that it would be someone she recognized. Ironveil was not a large pack in the way that mattered. The people who had access to the kind of information that had been used were a limited group, and she had been narrowing the list since Eli's first message, by running through names and motivations and opportunity with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She had been right about the motivation, wrong about the name. Not wrong in the sense of surprised. She had surprised herself out of the calculation early, had deliberately avoided assuming it was the most obvious candidate, because obvious candidates in her experience were usually cover for less obvious ones. She had been wrong in the sense of, this is worse than I thought. This goes deeper than I thought. This has been happening for longer than I thought. The wolf's name was Sareth, senior council member, 20-year tenure, the kind of institutional presence that had become indistinguishable from the institution itself. The person everyone assumed had always been there and would always be there. The person whose judgment was deferred to not because it was consistently good, but because challenging it required more energy than most people were willing to spend. Zara had worked alongside Sarath for 6 years, had submitted reports to the council that Sarath had reviewed, had made recommendations that Sarath had occasionally implemented and more often quietly buried. Had noticed over time certain patterns in which of her recommendations were acted on and which were not, had noticed that the ones most likely to be ignored were the ones that would have made certain financial arrangements more visible, certain alliance terms more transparent, certain territorial decisions harder to obscure. She had noticed. She had filed it. She had not known what to do with it because she had not had enough. Not enough to be certain, not enough to act on, not enough to bring to anyone without looking like an Omega-ranked archivist making accusations against a 20-year council member, which was not a story that ended well for the Omega-ranked archivist. She had been waiting for enough. Sarath, it turned out, had not been waiting. Sarath had moved first. The third thing she did on Wednesday was the hardest. She sat at the kitchen table in the house in Ashford with a blank document open on her laptop and thought about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it for a long time before she wrote anything. Then she wrote a message to Darian Steele, not through his beta, not through official channels. Directly, to the number she had for him, the one that appeared on Pack Communications, the one she had never once used for anything personal in 6 years. The message was not long. It said, "I know about the council meeting. I know about Sarath. I know why you did what you did. I am not writing to tell you that I understand it. I am writing to tell you that I am coming back to Ironveil on Thursday, and that what happens next is going to depend entirely on whether you are the alpha I have spent 6 years believing this pack deserves or the one it has actually had. You have until Thursday to decide which one you are. Don't respond to this message. I'll know what I need to know when I get there." She read it twice, sent it, closed the laptop, went to bed and slept better than she had in 3 weeks. She arrived at the Ironveil border at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. The border guard was a young wolf named Petra who had been on rotation duty for 8 months and had never once had to make a decision that mattered. She looked at Zara's car pulling up to the checkpoint with the expression of someone whose training had not covered this specific situation. Zara rolled down her window. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. Petra looked at her files, looked back at her. "Ms. Cole," she said carefully, your access to the territory was—" "My pack bond was never formally severed," Zara said. "Under regional pack law, Section 42, subsection 3, an abandonment under duress does not constitute a formal severance. I have documentation if you need it." She paused. "Do you need it?" Petra looked at her files again with the expression of someone who very much wished she had called in sick today. "I'll need to call this in," she said. "Of course," Zara said. "Take your time." She waited. The call took 6 minutes. She watched Petra's face change during the call, watched the young wolf go from uncertain to surprised to something that looked, at the end of the 6 minutes, remarkably like impressed. Petra put down her phone, raised the barrier. "Welcome back to Ironveil, Ms. Cole," she said. Zara drove through. The compound looked exactly the same. This was not surprising. 3 weeks was not enough time for things to look different. But she noticed it anyway, the way you notice the sameness of a place you have left and expected to find changed. The same stone paths, the same winter trees. The archive building with its single window, dark this morning, the room inside it waiting. She did not go to the archives. She drove to the main building, parked, got out of her car, walked through the front entrance of the building she had worked in for 6 years, the building where people had passed her in corridors and moved around her like furniture, and handed her work they did not want to do and taken credit for work she had done, and walked to the council chamber. The door was closed. She knocked once and opened it without waiting for an answer. The 12 council members of the Ironveil Pack looked up from a meeting that had clearly been in progress for some time. 12 faces doing 12 different calculations simultaneously. She read all of them in the 3 seconds it took her to close the door behind her and find the particular face she was looking for. Sarath was sitting at the far end of the table. Their eyes met. Sarath's expression moved through 3 things in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, and then the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that the move they thought they had made cleanly had not, in fact, been made cleanly at all. Zara set her bag on the nearest chair, took out a folder, set it on the table. "My name is Zara Cole," she said to the room. "I was a member of this pack for 24 years. 3 weeks ago, I was removed from it in a process that was legally irregular and politically motivated." She looked at Sarath. "I have documentation." Nobody spoke. "I also have documentation," she said, "of something else, something that some of you in this room already know about, and something that the rest of you are going to find significantly more interesting." She opened the folder. "We can do this 2 ways," she said. "The first way involves regional pack law, council oversight bodies, and a process that will take several months and will be deeply uncomfortable for a number of people in this room." She paused. "The second way involves a conversation, today, with full transparency, and an outcome that serves the pack instead of the people who have been using it." She looked around the table. "I would like to suggest the second way," she said, "but I am entirely prepared for the first." The council chamber was completely silent. Then the door behind her opened. But she did not turn around. She knew the sound of his footsteps. "So am I," said Darian Steele. "The thing about a room full of wolves is that silence in it is never just silence. It carries information. Wolves read silence the way humans read faces, involuntarily, automatically, with a precision that bypasses conscious thought entirely." The silence in the Ironveil council chamber in the 30 seconds after Darian walked through the door was carrying so much information that 3 of the 12 council members shifted in their seats without realizing they had done it. Zara noticed. She noticed which 3. She filed it. Darian came to stand beside her at the head of the table, not behind her, not in front of her, beside her. And she understood that this was deliberate. Was that the precise man who was careful about every signal he sent in public had chosen this position consciously, and that the signal it sent to 12 wolves who had spent years understanding his positioning was not subtle. She did not look at him. She looked at Sarath. Sarath had recovered. She gave them that. 20 years of council tenure had given Sarath a particular kind of composure. The composure of someone who had navigated difficult rooms for a very long time and knew that the worst thing you could do in a room that was turning against you was let it see you turn. They sat with their hands flat on the table, and their expression professionally neutral, and their eyes moving between Zara and Darian with the careful attention of someone calculating odds. "Alpha," Serath said. The word was addressed to Darian, but the eyes stayed on Zara. "I'm not certain this is the appropriate forum for whatever Ms. Cole believes she has to present. Given her current status with the pack," Darian said, "is under review. The council presented a recommendation," Darian said, "based on information that has since been found to be incomplete." A pause. The pause of a man who has been precise and careful and strategic for 3 weeks and is now, in this room, done with all of it. Significantly incomplete. Serath looked at him. "Perhaps this conversation would be better conducted privately," Serath said. The voice of someone buying time. Zara had heard that voice before, had heard it in the particular way certain recommendations of hers had been received in council meetings. The careful pivoting, the "we should discuss this further," which meant we should discuss this somewhere I can control the outcome. "No," Zara said. One word. Flat and final, and carrying 24 years of having been managed out of rooms in exactly this way. She opened the folder further. The documents she had prepared were organized in the way she organized everything. By the logic of the argument they made, each piece building on the previous one, the whole thing designed to be understood in sequence, so that by the time you reached the end, there was no interpretation available except the correct one. She had spent a long time on Wednesday thinking about how to present this. She had decided to present it the way she would present any archival finding, without drama, without the performance of accusation, just the record, laid out clearly, with the sources annotated and the patterns made visible. She started talking. It took 40 minutes. She had known it would take approximately this long because she had rehearsed it. Not the words, she did not script herself, but the logic, the sequence, and the places where she needed to pause and give the room time to absorb something before moving to the next thing. She talked about the financial arrangements first, the territorial agreements that had been structured to benefit specific external parties at Ironveil's expense, not dramatically, not in ways that were visible in any single document, but in aggregate over time, in the pattern that only became clear when you had access to the full record and the intelligence to understand what you were looking at. She talked about the information that had moved from the Ironveil archives to parties outside the pack over a period of 2 years. Not the classified records. Serath had been careful about that, had understood that taking the genuinely protected material would leave traces that were too obvious. What had moved was the contextual information, the background. The kind of knowledge that told you not what a pack had decided, but why. Not what its vulnerabilities were on paper, but what they were in practice. The kind of knowledge that only someone who had spent 20 years on the council would know was valuable. The kind of knowledge that only someone who had spent 6 years in the archives would be able to document. She talked about the council meeting 3 weeks ago, about the case that had been built against her, precise, thorough, as carefully packaged in the language of security concerns, and about what the case had actually been. Not a genuine assessment of risk, an elimination, a preemptive move against the one wolf in Ironveil who had both the access and the intelligence to document what Serath had been doing. She set the last document on the table. The exile was not the objective, she said. The exile was the method. The objective was to remove me from the archive before I found what I had already found. She looked at Serath. You were 3 weeks too late, she said. The council chamber stayed quiet for a long time after she finished. The quality of the quiet was different from the quiet at the beginning. The beginning had been the silence of 12 wolves calculating. This was the silence of 12 wolves who had finished calculating and arrived at a place where the numbers were no longer complicated. Serath had not moved. Their hands were still flat on the table. Their expression was still professionally neutral. But something behind the neutrality had shifted. Something that Zara recognized from 6 years of watching powerful people encounter irrefutable things as the moment when the decision changes from how do I win this to how do I survive it. This is a significant set of accusations, Serath said finally. The voice was steady. impressively steady. But based on archival interpretation that... Based on primary source documentation, Zara said, annotated and sourced. Every claim I have made in the last 40 minutes is supported by a document in that folder. Every document in that folder is available for independent verification. She paused. I would welcome independent verification. Another silence. Marin Voss has a copy, Zara added pleasantly. Something moved through the room at that. Not panic. These were not people who panicked visibly, but the particular recalibration of people who have just understood that the situation has already moved beyond the room they are sitting in. Sarath looked at Darian. Alpha, they said. A different tone now, the tone of someone making a final calculation. Whatever the documentation suggests, the appropriate response is a formal council review process, not a... I agree, Darian said. Sarath stopped. A formal council review process, Darian said, beginning immediately, under joint oversight from the Regional Pack Authority and an independent legal observer. He paused. Marin Voss has already agreed to serve in that capacity. The silence this time was very different. Zara looked at him for the first time since he had walked through the door. He had been busy on Wednesday. She filed that too. Sarath was removed from the council before noon. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment of public humiliation. Darian handled it with the precision she had spent 6 years observing in him. A private conversation, a formal notification, the machinery of consequence moving efficiently and without spectacle. 2 of the 3 council members who had shifted in their seats resigned their positions by the end of the day. The 3rd requested a meeting with Darian and came out of it an hour later looking considerably smaller than they had gone in. The formal review process that Marin Voss would oversee was announced to the full pack by evening. Zara spent the day in the archives, not working on anything official. She walked through the room that had been hers for 6 years, reacquainting herself with it, checking that the system she had built was still intact, that the 3 weeks of her absence had not introduced the kind of casual disorder that accumulated when people used a system without understanding it. It was mostly intact. There were 3 misfiled documents and 1 territorial record that had been pulled and not returned to its correct position. She fixed them. Automatically, without thinking about it, the way you straighten something that is crooked without deciding to. She was sitting at her desk in the late afternoon, the archive room going dark around her as the winter light faded, when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. She did not look up. She heard him stop in the doorway. They heard the particular quality of silence that surrounded a person who has something significant to say and has not yet decided how to begin. She let him stand there. Not cruelly. Not as performance. Because she had spent 6 years giving this room and everyone connected to it exactly what they needed the moment they needed it. And she had decided somewhere on the road between Ashford and Ironveil that she was done doing that. He could find his own beginning. He stood in the doorway for 40 seconds. Then he said, "You fixed the misfiled documents." 3 of them, she said, "and a territorial record." A pause. "You've been back for 8 hours. The system doesn't maintain itself." Another pause. Longer. She heard him move, not toward her, just into the room, the way he had come into the room on the night 3 years ago when the Voss challenge had gone badly and he had stood in the dark for 40 minutes not saying anything. She remembered that night. She remembered choosing not to acknowledge him, keeping her eyes on the work, giving him the room without making it a thing. She understood now, with information she had not had then, what he had been doing in this room that night, not just existing somewhere quiet, looking for something. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the archive room with his hands in his pockets, and the expression she had seen in the council chamber, the expression of a man who has been precise and careful and strategic for so long that the effort of it has become visible. And something underneath it that she had not seen before. Not guilt. She had expected guilt and would have known how to handle guilt, had the particular skill, developed over years of being wronged by people who felt bad about it, of receiving remorse without being undone by it. This was not guilt. This was the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been in a room where he did not have to carry it alone and does not yet know what to do with the relief of that. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me several things," she said. "Start with the explanation." He did. He talked for a long time. Not 40 minutes, longer than that. He talked through the council meeting and the 3 days of independent investigation, and the 2 choices he had seen and the reasoning behind the one he had made. He talked about it the way he did very few things, without the management, without the careful shaping of information for maximum effect, just the sequence of it, what he had known and when he had known it, and what he had decided and why. He did not ask her to understand it. He did not frame it as something she should forgive. He presented it the way she presented archival findings, as a record. Here is what happened. Here is what I knew. Here is what I chose. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interruption, filing each piece in the correct place, letting the full picture assemble before she responded to any part of it. When he finished, the archive room was very quiet. The winter dark was complete outside the single window. The lamp on her desk was the only light in the room. It made the space feel smaller than it was, contained, private, the particular intimacy of 2 people in a pool of light with everything else in shadow. "You could have told me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You chose not to. I told myself it was to protect you, that if you didn't know, you couldn't be pressured into—" He stopped. "That's not the whole truth." She waited. "The whole truth," he said carefully. Is that telling you would have required me to have a conversation I did not know how to have? About more than Sarath, about—" He stopped again. The stopping of a man who has been precise about language for his entire adult life, encountering something that precision is not adequate for. "About the fact that I have been aware of you, specifically, particularly in a way that had nothing to do with the archives, for 2 years, and have not known what to do with that. And used Sarath as a reason not to figure it out." The lamp on the desk hummed very quietly. Zara looked at him. At this man who had been precise and careful and strategic and had used all of those things at various points as armor against something he did not know how to face directly. She thought about the one-line message, the 4 hours he had spent with her archival report, the 3 days of independent investigation that nobody had asked him to conduct. She thought about him standing in this room 3 years ago in the dark, not saying anything, just being somewhere that she was. "You have been in this room before," she said. "Late, when you didn't need anything." He looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "How many times?" A pause. "More than I would be comfortable telling you in one conversation," he said. Something moved through her chest. Not the melting thing, not the collapse she had been careful against for 6 years. Something more complicated and more structural. The feeling of a load-bearing wall discovering it had been carrying more weight than it knew, and that the weight was not, in fact, too much. "You exiled me," she said, not with heat, just as a fact that needed to stay in the room. "Yes, in front of 400 people. Yes, without warning and without a conversation. Yes." She looked at him for a long time. "I need you to understand," she said carefully, "that the explanation does not undo the thing, that knowing why does not make the thing not have happened, that I walked out of this compound 3 weeks ago with 40 minutes notice and 1 bag and the particular experience of hearing my name said into a microphone by someone who could not look at me when he said it." He held her gaze. "I understand," he said. And the way he said it, not quickly, not as a concession to move past, told her that he actually did. "Good," she said. A silence. I'm reinstating your position," he said, formally, with the title and compensation that the work has always warranted and never received. "I know," she said. "I'm accepting it. And the consulting contracts with Voss and the Eastern Collective, I'm keeping them. she said. "They're mine. I built them in 3 weeks on my own, and they belong to me." Something moved across his face that might, in a different light, have been the beginning of a smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The lamp hummed. Outside the window, the winter dark was complete. "Darian," she said. He looked at her. "The thing you said, about being aware of me, in a way that had nothing to do with the archives." He was very still. "Yes," he said carefully. "I need you to know," she said, "that I am not the person I was 3 weeks ago. I am not the person who spent 6 years making herself invisible and waiting for someone to notice and telling herself that was enough." She paused. "That person is gone. She walked out of this compound 3 weeks ago, and she is not coming back." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "The person who came back today," she said, "needs different things, requires different things. Will not arrange herself around anyone's comfort, will not make herself smaller. Will not wait." She held his gaze. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The archive room was very quiet. Darian Steele looked at the woman standing in the lamplight in the room she had rebuilt from the ground up. The woman who had walked into his council chamber that morning with a folder and dismantled 3 years of careful corruption in 40 minutes, who had fixed 3 misfiled documents within hours of returning, who was looking at him right now with the absolute clear-eyed directness of someone who has decided that the time for indirectness is comprehensively over, and said the truest thing he had said in years. "I understand that I have a great deal to prove," he said, "and that proving it is going to require considerably more than a conversation in the archive room." A pause. "And that I am prepared to do that, whatever it requires, for however long it takes." Zara looked at him. "Then we have an understanding," she said. She turned back to her desk, picked up the territorial record that had been misfiled, returned it to its correct position with the particular satisfaction of something put back where it belonged. "There's a council debrief tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock. I'll need access to the full financial records from the last 3 years for the Marin Voss review." "You'll have them by 7, he said. "Good." She sat down, opened her laptop. "You can go, Darian." He moved toward the door. Stopped. She heard him stop. "Zara," he said. She did not look up. "I see you," he said. Simply. The words of a man who has finally, irreversibly understood the difference between looking and seeing, and is saying so in the only language he has left. "I know that is late. I know it is not enough on its own. But I need you to know that I see you, that I have been seeing you for longer than I had the courage to say so, and that I intend," a pause, as the pause of a man choosing his words with the full weight of everything they need to carry, "to spend a significant amount of time making sure you know it." The lamp hummed. Zara looked at the screen in front of her, allowed herself, quietly, privately, in the part of herself that she kept very still, one single moment of feeling the full weight of those words land somewhere real. Then she went back to work. 7 o'clock, she said. "Don't be late." She heard him almost smile. She heard him leave. The archive room settled back into its particular quiet, the quiet of 6 generations of records and 1 lamp and the winter dark outside the window, and a woman who had come back to a place that had exiled her and had, in the course of one Thursday, changed everything about what it was. She worked until midnight. When she finally closed her laptop and put on her coat and walked out of the archive building into the cold night air, the compound was dark and still and completely quiet. She stood on the path for a moment, looked at the building she had cleaned before she was old enough to attend the gatherings inside it, looked at the archive building with its single dark window, looked at the winter trees and the cold stars and the particular darkness of a December night in Ironveil territory. The pack bond, thin and strange and abandoned for 3 weeks, was different now. Not the background hum she had spent 24 years not noticing. Something more deliberate, more present. The feeling of something that had been gone and had come back changed, the way things come back changed when they have been tested. She pulled her coat tighter, walked toward the housing block. Halfway there, her phone buzzed. A message, sent at 12:03 in the morning, from Darian. 6 words. The records will be there at 6. She looked at the message for a moment. He typed back 2 words. I know. Put her phone in her pocket. Walked the rest of the way in the cold and the quiet and the particular feeling of a place that was hers again. Not because she had been given it back, but because she had walked back into it on her own terms and taken it. That was different. That was everything. 6 months later, the Ironveil Pack looked different. Not in the ways that photographs would capture. The compound was the same stone and winter trees. The Great Hall still stood with its 6 generations of absorbed history. The archive building still had its single window that went dark when Zara finally went home and lit again before most of the pack had finished breakfast. The physical geography of the place was unchanged. What was different was harder to point to and more important than anything you could photograph. It was in the way the council meetings ran now. Shorter, more precise, with less of the circular political performance that had characterized them for years, and more of the thing that council meetings were supposed to be, which was people making good decisions for the right reasons with full information. It was in the way senior wolves who had spent years treating the archive as a repository for things they wanted to forget about were now walking through that door regularly, asking questions, actually reading the answers. It was in the way 3 wolves who had been quietly doing the work that kept Ironveil functioning, invisible, essential, unacknowledged, had been formally recognized, properly titled, and appropriately compensated in the 6 months since Zara Cole had walked back through the compound gate on a Thursday morning with a folder and changed the terms. It was in the way the pack felt, which was the way a pack feels when the people running it have stopped pretending that power is the same thing as leadership. Zara had not done all of this. She needed to be precise about that in the accounting she kept with herself. She had done the part she had always done, the work, the documentation, the quiet, systemic interventions that fixed things before they became crises. The difference was that the work was visible now, was credited, was part of the official record rather than the unofficial one. Darian had done the rest. He had been as good as his word. This was the thing she had not let herself assume, had refused to assume, had held at arm's length through the first weeks of being back, through the council debrief and the Marin Voss review process and the formal reinstatement and the 12-hour days that had been necessary to stabilize things in the aftermath of Serath's removal. She had watched, instead of assumed. She had watched him show up at 6 every morning with the financial records she needed, not because she had asked him to keep doing it after the first time, but because he understood that the work required it, and the work was what she needed from him before she needed anything else. She had watched him navigate the political fallout of the council restructuring with the precision she had always known he was capable of, not perfectly. There were 2 decisions she would have made differently, and she told him so directly, and he listened, and in one case changed course, and in the other made his reasoning clear enough that she understood it even when she disagreed. But with a consistency that told her the alignment between what he said and what he did was not performance. She had watched him learn to read her the way she had spent 6 years reading him. That had taken longer. It was harder to learn to read someone who had spent years making herself unreadable than it was to read someone who had spent years being watched. He got it wrong sometimes, moved too fast or not fast enough, or misread her silence as distance when it was actually just her processing, which was a different thing entirely. When he got it wrong, she told him. This was new. Not for him, for her. The particular adjustment of being with someone who genuinely wanted to know when he had gotten it wrong, who did not treat her telling him as an attack to be defended against, but as information to be used. She was still getting used to it. She thought she might be getting used to it for a long time. The day that mattered most happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Not because Tuesdays had any particular significance, because the things that matter most, she had learned, almost never happen on the days that announce themselves as significant. They happen in the gaps between the significant days, in the ordinary hours when nobody is performing anything for anyone. She was in the archive at 7 in the morning. Darian was in the chair across from her desk, which was his chair now, in the sense that it had been moved from the corner where it had always stood to directly across from her workspace. Oh, a migration that had happened so gradually that she could not identify the specific day it became permanent. They were working. Not together on the same thing. She was cross-referencing the new alliance documentation with historical precedents. He was reviewing the restructured council bylaws, but in the same space, which was the thing they had both discovered they were good at, existing in productive parallel. Sharing a room the way people share a room when they have stopped needing to fill the space between them with performance. She had been aware, in her peripheral vision, of him reading the same page for longer than the page required. She had filed it. After the third time, she looked up. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "I've been trying to find the right way to say something for 3 weeks," he said. "You've been trying to find the perfect way," she said. "Which is different. The perfect way doesn't exist. Just say it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the bylaws and looked at her with the expression she had come to know over 6 months of watching him. The expression that appeared when he had stopped managing himself and was just being present, which was the expression she trusted most, because it was the one that cost him something to show. "I drew buildings," he said. She waited. "Before my father died. For 3 years. I had a drawer full of plans for structures I was never going to build, and I locked it when I became Alpha, and I have not opened it since." He paused. "I don't tell people that. I have never told anyone that who is still alive." The archive room was very quiet. "Why are you telling me?" she said. "Because you told me who you were becoming," he said. "That day in this room. You told me the person who had made herself invisible was gone, and the person who came back required different things. And I understood what you were telling me, but I have spent 6 months wondering if I told you the equivalent." He paused. "Whether you know who I am. Not the Alpha. Not the man who made the wrong choice and is trying to make it right. The person underneath those things." Zara looked at him. At this man who had locked a drawer at 23 and never opened it, and was sitting across from her at 7 in the morning, telling her about it because she had told him the truth about herself, and he understood that truth required truth in return. "Show me," she said. He looked at her. "The drawer," she said. "Show me what's in it." They went to his office. She had been in it before, twice for official business, in and out. The functional brevity of someone who does not linger in spaces that are not hers. She looked at it differently now. Read it the way she read everything, for the information it contained about the person who inhabited it. It was precise, ordered. Everything in its correct position with the particular tidiness of someone who controls their environment because control of their environment is what they have instead of certain other things. He went to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, took out a key that lived under a particular document that she noted the location of automatically. Went to the cabinet against the far wall, unlocked it. Inside, stacked carefully, preserved with the specific attention of someone who could not bring themselves to destroy something even when they had decided they would never use it, were 3 years of architectural drawings. He took them out, set them on the desk, stepped back. She came forward. She looked at them for a long time. They were extraordinary, not in the polished way of professional work. They had the quality of something made by someone who was teaching themselves, who was working at the edge of their knowledge and pushing past it, whose mistakes were visible, and whose corrections were visible, and whose ambition was visible in both. Structures that were designed for specific landscapes she recognized, the Ironveil territory. Its hills and tree lines and the particular relationship between the compound and the forest that she had spent 24 years inside. He had been drawing buildings for this place, buildings that understood the place, that were in conversation with the landscape rather than imposed on it. She looked at one specific drawing for a long time, was the design for something that appeared to be a gathering space built into the edge of the forest, a quality she did not immediately have a word for and then found it. They felt like home. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression of someone who has shown someone something real and is waiting, without trying to manage the wait, to find out what they think. "You should have been building things," she said. "Yes," he said quietly. "You're going to build this one," she said. She set her finger on the gathering space drawing. "When the review process is complete and the council is stable and there is bandwidth for a project, this one, here." She looked at him. "That is not a suggestion." Something moved through his face. "You can't just," he started. "I absolutely can," she said. "I spent 6 years not saying what I thought needed to happen. I am done with that." She looked at the drawing. "This building needs to exist. You need to build it. These are facts." He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not the practiced neutrality she had spent 6 years reading from a distance. It was not the composure under pressure she had watched him perform in council chambers. It was not even the careful, honest presence she had come to know over 6 months of 7 o'clock mornings. It was something she had not seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who has been seen. Completely. And in the specific way that requires someone to have been paying attention for a long time, to know not just the visible things but the locked drawer, the abandoned plans, the 23-year-old who wanted to build things and made a different choice. The expression of a man who has just understood what it means to be known. "Zara," he said. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Don't make it a speech. You're terrible at speeches." Something that was completely, unmistakably a smile moved across his face. "I'm not terrible at speeches," he said. "You're adequate at speeches," she said. "You're considerably better at other things." She picked up the drawing. "Can I take this to the archive? I want to cross-reference it with the territorial surveys from the eastern section." He looked at her. "You want to cross-reference my architectural drawings with territorial surveys?" "The placement matters," she said. "Oh, if you're going to build it where I think you should build it, I need to check the survey records from 1987. There was a drainage issue on that section of the tree line that was resolved, but I want to make sure the resolution was properly documented." She headed for the door. "I'll have it back to you by noon." "Zara." She stopped. She turned around. He had crossed the office in the time it took her to reach the door. She had not heard him move. She never heard him move. In 6 months, she had not managed to track him the way she tracked everything else, and she had concluded that this was simply something she was going to have to accept. And he was standing close enough that she had to look up at him. He was not performing anything. "I have been precise about time," he said, "and precise about signals, and precise about every word I say in public for 5 years. Because precision felt like control, and control felt like safety, and safety felt necessary when everything else felt—" He stopped. "Large." She waited. "I am going to be less precise right now," he said, "because precision is not what this requires." She looked at him. At the man who had locked a drawer and walked to a podium and stood in an archive room in the dark and driven to a town called Ashford and walked through a council chamber door at exactly the right moment. At the man who had been seeing her for longer than he had the courage to say so, and had finally, at 7 in the morning in a room full of locked history, decided to say so in the only language he had. Not words. He reached out and took her face in his hands, both hands, the gesture deliberate and entirely certain, the gesture of someone who has stopped managing and started meaning, and kissed her with the specific, the unhurried intention of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided, once and for all, that the right moment is the one where you stop waiting. The archive drawings were still in her hand. She did not drop them. She was, after all, a thorough person, but her other hand found the front of his jacket and held on, not with the careful, managed holding of someone protecting themselves, but with the full, certain grip of someone who has decided, completely and without reservation, that this is worth holding on to. The office was very quiet. Outside the window, the winter had broken. The first suggestion of something warmer moving through the bare trees, the particular quality of light that meant the season was changing. When she finally stepped back, she looked at the drawing in her hand, then at him. "I'm still cross-referencing the survey records," she said. He looked at her. "I know. And the project goes through proper territorial planning review, obviously. And you are building it exactly where I said." The smile again. The real one. The one that had nothing managed about it, that lived entirely outside the vocabulary of an alpha-performing competence for a room. "Obviously," he said. She turned and walked back toward the archive. Halfway down the corridor, she allowed herself, quietly, privately, in the part of herself that she had spent 6 years keeping very still and had spent 6 months very carefully, very deliberately, learning to let move. A smile that she gave to nobody in particular. She had always known where everything was buried. It turned out that included this. The archive door opened. She went back to work.